Thank you, Austin. I'll also mention that I've had the honor of working with Bill Anderson, who just spoke a moment ago, on the Michigan Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Committee, which has been just a great effort. Bill has done great work, and we're all excited this week to get here and talk about Lincoln and remember him on his 200th birthday. I'd like to start actually by acknowledging my colleague, Gleaves Whitney, who you'll have the opportunity to meet outside if you want. I think he's one room over for another one of our lectures. We were on our way to D.C. a few weeks ago for a conference we did out there assessing the Bush legacy. And I was trying to work out what I was going to say here this morning. I knew why I thought Lincoln was heroic, and this is what I was telling Gleaves. And eventually he stopped me and he said, well, that's Joseph Campbell. And that immediately clicked in for me, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. But he was spot on, and Joseph Campbell, I think, is a great lens. Joseph Campbell on the hero's journey is a great lens to look at the life of Lincoln, and I think Lincoln is a great lens to better understand Joseph Campbell and what his writing and all his speaking was about. So with that, I'll just get started. Thank you all, too, for being here. This is great, and thanks to the Michigan Council for the Social Studies, who also does great work. And you know what, I'll acknowledge my dad, too, who's in the audience, Mike Flanagan, Superintendent of Public Instruction here. He's probably going to hate me, but he needs to be acknowledged. There is no new thing to be said about Lincoln, a congressman from Kansas once eulogized. There is no new thing to be said of the mountains, or of the sea, or of the stars. The years go their way, but the same old mountains lift their granite shoulders above the drifting clouds. The same mysterious sea beats upon the shore. The same silent stars keep holy vigil over the tired world. But to the mountains and sea and stars men turn forever in unwearied homage. And thus with Lincoln. For he was a mountain and grandeur of soul. He was a deep sea undervoice of mysterious loneliness. He was a star in steadfast purity, in purpose and service, and he abides. 1 year before these words were uttered, President Warren Harding dedicated the Lincoln Memorial, housed in a shrine designed to mimic the Temple of Zeus in Olympia. Lincoln's massive 20-foot marble statue towers above visitors as they enter, below the inscription, "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is forever enshrined." A surviving 19th century silver print has Lincoln in the arms of George Washington, wearing Apollo's laurel crown and ascending bodily into heaven. Since his assassination, it's fair to say, we Americans have been none too bashful in our praise of Lincoln. Mythology in marble, however, can obscure flesh and blood, and it is the work of historians to bring Lincoln back to life as a human being, to give us a more intimate view of the man. It is important, for example, to understand Lincoln's views on race and on civil liberties in wartime. It is important to explore the controversies of Lincoln's life and legacy, and to find substance and truth. Lincoln scholars today, Donald, McPherson, Goodwin, Galzo, Holzer, and others, are doing a commendable job of it. Yet I'm going to argue this should not detract from the myth of Lincoln, which itself is quite valuable. Joseph Campbell, the late writer and mythologist, spent a career finding red threads connecting the myths of the great cultures of the world. Mythology, said Campbell, has a pedagogical function of how to live a human lifetime under any circumstances. Myths, he said, can teach you that. Those of you familiar with Joseph Campbell's work will be familiar with his best-known book, The Hero of a Thousand Faces, which traces the journey of what he calls the archetypal hero and links Odysseus to Muhammad, to Christ, to the Buddha, and King Arthur, and George Washington, and Luke Skywalker. The list goes on and on. It's everywhere. In The Hero's Journey, Campbell found a mythology that spans all cultures and all times, a truly human story. The plot is simple. Our hero receives a call to adventure, accepts it, crosses a threshold into an unfamiliar world, endures a road of trials, and ultimately obtains a boon, often at the cost of great personal sacrifice, that will redound to the benefit of the broader society. These heroes are sometimes fictional, sometimes factual, but their journey one we will clarify through Lincoln's example in a moment, blazes a trail that we can envision when we hear our own calls to adventure. We have not to risk the adventure alone, Campbell said, for the heroes of all time have gone before us. The labyrinth is thoroughly known. We have only to follow the thread of the hero path. We read and hear stories in our youth and adolescence. We witness heroic actions throughout our lifetime, and along the way, we learn important lessons. One of which, in Campbell's words, is that at the bottom of the abyss comes the voice of salvation. At the darkest moment comes light. Lincoln, as we shall see, made great use of this lesson. He, of course, had numerous heroes, men who helped light the path when he received his call. He grew up with Parson Weems's heroic depiction of George Washington, Shakespeare's political and tragic heroes, Marcus Brutus, Lear, Macbeth, Hamlet, fascinated Lincoln. In politics, he had Henry Clay and Daniel Webster. Most importantly, he had his Bible and the heroic journeys of Moses and Jesus. These heroes had an enormous impact on Lincoln's thinking, and they helped shape his life and work. So of course we must bring heroes down to the ground, to the flesh and blood, to the full substance of truth we can obtain. But we must also celebrate what is heroic in them, internalize their lessons, and then we can call upon their example when we face our own physical and spiritual trials. Lincoln, I think, is truly heroic in three primary ways. We can recognize, in other words, three heroes' journeys in which Lincoln accepted a call to action, endured great trials, and obtained a boon for his fellow man. First, he overcame his own debilitating depression and the sorrowful events of his life, and emerged with an ambition, in his words, to make the world a little better for my having lived in it. Second, he overcame his own poverty and emerged as a competent professional, with a skill set and the wherewithal to achieve his ambition, and the rise from the log cabin to the White House. Third, Lincoln's most recognizably heroic act, he overcame the nation's profound divisions and removed forever from the land the great sin of slavery. First, let's look at Lincoln's depression, his inner hero's journey. We recognize today that Lincoln was likely genetically predisposed to depression. His father had a depressive streak, often striking out on long, lonely walks in the woods, muttering to himself. His mother was known for her melancholy, and the family of his uncles and aunts and cousins exhibited symptoms of mental illness, many of them landing later in asylums. Lincoln himself was remembered by family, neighbors, and work associates as a profoundly melancholy man. He wore a sadness on his face. There's a now famous story about Leo Tolstoy venturing into the Caucasus Mountains between Europe and Asia and discussing Lincoln's accomplishments with a Muslim chieftain there. He spoke with a voice of thunder. He laughed like the sunrise, and his deeds were as strong as rock, the chieftain said of Lincoln. After seeing a photograph of Lincoln, however, his tone changed. He gazed at it for several minutes, Tolstoy later remembered, like one in a reverent prayer, his eyes filled with tears. He was deeply touched, and I asked him why he had become so sad. After pondering my question for a moment, he replied, "Don't you find, judging from his picture, that his eyes are full of tears, and that his lips are sad with a secret sorrow?" Lincoln struggled mightily with his depression. His neighbors and friends would long remember his withdrawn, moody spells. They were common, in the words of Lincoln biographer Joshua Wolf Schenck. They were just one thread of a curious fabric of behavior and thought that Lincoln friends and colleagues called his melancholy. He often wept in public and recited maudlin poetry. He told jokes and stories at odd times. He needed the laughs, he said, for his survival. As a young man, he talked of suicide, and as he grew older, he said he saw the world as a hard and grim place, full of misery, made that way by the fates and forces of God. Not exactly the Lincoln we remember today. According to one of Lincoln's work associates, legal associates, no element of Mr. Lincoln's character was so marked, obvious, and ingrained as his mysterious and profound melancholy. Lincoln's longtime law partner, who conducted numerous interviews with family members and friends and wrote one of the first and best researched biographies after his death, said that his melancholy dripped from him as he walked.